Hi students, welcome to the BYJU'S Hindu News Analysis for 11th of November 2018. So let's get started. So let's look into the first article. So the first article that we will be discussing about is in reference to the improvised explosive devices. So the first question that pops up is, what is this improvised devices? So basically when we speak about the IEDs, these are nothing but the roadside bombs. So these roadside bombs are employed by the non-state actors, the guerrilla warfares, as well as insurgents against the security personnel as well as the conventional military force. So what is the context that we are speaking about? Currently what is happening is you have the number of Maoists who are using these IEDs as an easier way to inflict maximum amount of casualties to the security personnel. That is why this becomes a very important article in terms of your GS3 paper, that is in security. So the first important point we have to consider is there are two types of detonations. So what are these two types? One, you have the command detonation, the other is the autonomous one. So what is this command detonation? It means it will require the human intervention, and when we say it is autonomous, this will not require any human's presence, human action. So this will activate on its own due to some technological advancements. So the next thing that we have to understand is how does it work in the command, which happens via the human intervention. So what happens is you have the receiver here and you also have the sender here. This can happen via the wire as well as the wireless means. So what do we mean by it? Let's take for example, there is one of the road that is passing here, and then you also have this explosive that is placed on the road. So this is connected via a wire or without a wire, which is the wireless communication means. So what happens is, let's say for example there is one of the army security personnel's vehicle that is moving in this area. So there would be sending one of the electric impulses. This activates this whole explosive, and the minute they approach this explosive, then there is the impulse that is passed, and this impulse that is passed immediately detonates, and there is this explosive that immediately fires up, and then there is a large scale casualty that is a resultant of this. On the other side, what we also have to understand is it can happen autonomously, and this will not require any human action. So in this method what we have is a number of types. So one such material is called as the tripwire. So what happens in this tripwire is you have a thin line that is attached to the IEDs, so you would not be able to see it through the naked eyes. So the minute the vehicle approaches and then it breaks this touches this wire, what you see is that particular explosion immediately taking place. So apart from this, what you also see is the pressure plates. So what is this pressure plate? So this is one of the triggering mechanism when a certain amount of weight, let's say for example there is a human or there is a vehicle which is placed on it, then the detonation takes place. So you have the second mechanism, which is the pressure plates, and the third important tool that we also see is the infrared system. As we had discussed, there was one of the mechanisms where we have the sender as well as the receiver, but this happens without the intervention. Right now what happens is you have a continuous beam of light that goes between the sender as well as the receiver, but what happens in this case is now that there is the infrared beam which is continuously beaming towards the receiver as well as the sender, when you have a vehicle that is passing through, what happens is there is an obstruction. So the vehicle is passing through it, so the receiver is not able to get this particular beam from the sender. It means the infrared system immediately gets activated, the trigger mechanism gets activated, and there is that explosion that happens. So next what we have is another important one, and that is to do with the magnetic detonators. So what happens in this system is there is a magnetic field in and around that particular area or the area where it is planted, but when there is a vehicle that passes through, it means it exerts certain amount of magnetism, and when there is certain amount of magnetism which is comparatively more or less than what was there in the initial field, then again this particular mechanism gets activated, and then what you see is the explosion. So what we have to understand in reference to this article is it gives us certain statistical evidence. So what are these statistical evidence? It says there has been a 100% increase in the IEDs that have been recovered in Chhattisgarh Chhattisgarh in 2018 compared to 2013. While as many as 57 IEDs were recovered in 2013, 116 have been found this year with 84 recoveries in October and 23 in November alone. So the next question that pops up is, how is that they are able to get these sources for the IEDs? The Maoists basically have one of the objectives or an intended agenda. So the intended agenda is the kill and take strikes. So you have the army personnel who are venturing into the forest. They may not know certain areas in and around this region. So what happens is these Maoists kill these security personnel and they take up all those important arms and equipments, which may involve certain handguns, or it may involve the rifles. It may also involve various AK-47 assault rifles as well. And apart from this, what we also need to understand is these people go about looting all the mining as well as the infrastructure businesses. So the moment they go on to loot these important businesses, they'll be able to get certain commodities, certain manufacturing entities. These things that are looted from the mining operations can be used in manufacturing these important IEDs. They have something called as the parallel economy. So what is this parallel economy? So this means basically you have the extortion rackets as well as the theft that takes place. So what happens is you have all these rich people in and around that area. They go on a kidnapping racket, they go on an extortion racket. So the minute they have the financial independence, they would have links with all the international people where they would be able to get their arms and ammunition. There are certain international organizations. So these international organizations may be the state actors or the non-state actors. Let's take for example the state actors. The state actors in this particular case may involve the ISI, or you may also have certain other state actors which involves the Chinese as well. So what is also being said is the ISI as well as certain aspects from China are sending their arms and ammunition so that they can create a problem in Indian internal security. All these actions that have been initiated by the Maoists have a particular definition. What we are speaking about is the TCOC. So what does this TCOC stands for? It stands for the Tactical Counter-Offensive Campaign. So this Tactical Counter-Offensive Campaign usually happens in the period of March to June, and this can also happen during the polling seasons as well. So currently Chhattisgarh is going through the polls. So this is one of the agendas of the Maoists where they want to inflict maximum damage on the security personnel, one during March to June as well as during the polling seasons. So now that we have understood what are all these IEDs, what are the various commands that has been taking place, where are the sources that it is emanating from, what we also need to come up with is certain solutions. One of the basic and the most important point that we have to consider is n number of researchers have been done, and all these researchers have easily said that there is one of the operations that is done in the mining, and that is to do with the detonating wire. So all these detonating wires have been employed in the mining operations. They are used to break all those huge chunks of rocks, but these detonating wires that are used in the mining operations are also used in these areas of IEDs. So this is acting as the primary catalyst behind the numerous deadly IED blasts in the red corridors of the country. So the first point that we have to make sure is what is the source of these detonating wires, where is it being transferred, and how is that it is reaching the Maoists. So what we have to make sure is what is the source, where is it reaching. So in case we are able to stop from source to the destination, then we would make sure that the first step is actually accomplished. The second important point that we have to understand in this solution is that we have seen that US has fought one of the longest war battles in Afghanistan as well as in Iraq. So in this particular area, what they also endorsed and came across was this IED explosions, and they came up with one of the important mechanisms, and this mechanism was called as the GIADO. So what is this GIADO? This basically means Joint IED Defeat Organization. So this is one of the umbrella organization which will have all the security personnel involved to make sure that the entire system is dismantled. So what does this system or this developmental criminal organization involved. This basically has three principles. One is to attack the network. So how are we attacking the network? By making sure the source and the destination is identified. So the first point it raises is identify where exactly we will have to stop it. So we will have to attack it. So I am attacking that organization which is transferring the IEDs from the source to the destination. After I have identified this attack, that is from the source to the destination, what we also need is certain R&D. Let's take for example this guerrilla warfare has come up with a device. So this device has to be stopped from detonating or exploding. So what we need is a R&D team. So the next point that we have to raise within the Indian organization as well is that we need an R&D team which will include the security personnel, which will include the DRDO, and all this should be under a single umbrella so that there is no ambiguity in this particular process. And the third thing that we also need is a force, and it is this force, in case we are still not able to figure out and we are still not able to make sure, we need a team so that it can detonate it, and it is this team which will have all the required information so that it can come up with possible solutions in case there is any immediate emergency. So all in all, what we need to make sure is we have an attack force which is able to find the source as well as the destination, and then we need certain R&D which will have certain, let's say for example the UAVs that are employed, so they are able to use certain lasers to detect the buried explosives, and finally a force which is able to make sure it can neutralize this explosive. So all this is what we can employ in the Indian organization, taking the experiences from the United States of America. This is all we need to understand in reference to this article. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So the next article is important from GS1 perspective, and that is to do with the culture. So what are we discussing about? So what we are discussing is about the Kothin Chibor Dan. So what is this? So this is one of the important and the religious festivals of the Buddhist devotees. So what happens in this case is you have a word called as Chibor. This is basically nothing but it is a fabric, or you can call it a cloth. So what happens is you have the disciples here. So the disciples here go on to gift a particular fabric or a cloth as a dan, that is as a gift or something as a service to the Buddhist monks. So you have the disciple who is gifting this chibor, which is the fabric or a cloth, to a Buddhist monk, and this Buddhist monk who receives this gift from the disciple prays for the goodwill or the happiness of the disciple who's gifted this. So this is all we have to understand, but kindly remember this can be a prospective question in your prelims examination. That is why we have discussed this. So moving on, let's look into the next article. In this article, what we are discussing is about the Apple as an economic product. So in this, what is the most important point is the context. So when we look into the context, Kashmir witnessed untimely heavy snowfall, and this happened during last week, that is November 3rd and 4th, and as a result of which a large number of people are facing a brunt of the nature. Why? Because of the untimely snowfall that has happened in this region of Kashmir, which involves the center, the north as well as the south region of Kashmir, has got a lot of economic devastation, and this has caused a paralysis in their personal economies as well. So what we have to understand is, let's understand the basic framework as to where apples are found, which are the state producing in India, and then what are the varieties and what is that the government has done in order to make sure that these people do not face the brunt of the nature. So the first important point that we have to understand is apple is basically a temperate crop. So which are the states that produce a lot of apples? First in the lane is Jammu and Kashmir, then it is followed by Himachal Pradesh, and then it is followed by Uttarakhand, and finally we have on the fourth place, that is Arunachal Pradesh, which also produces apple. So there are various varieties that are produced. So the varieties that is important here is you have the Golden Delicious, Lal Ambri, Mollis Delicious, Star Crimson, Krish Peach, Binoni and Tedmans, which are produced in Jammu and Kashmir. And in Himachal Pradesh again you have the Golden Delicious and the Red Delicious as well as McClintosh. You don't have to remember the places, but kindly remember all these important varieties that you see in apples. And the next you have is the Melintosh and Chaubatia Anupam in Uttarakhand, and in Tamil Nadu you also see the Irish Peach, Zonchus Pepin, Carrington, Winterstein, Rome Beauty, as well as the Parlinge Beauty. So what is the economical impact? So because of these untimely snowfall, what we see is an estimated loss of about 1000 crores. So because the people have suffered a large scale economic losses, what we see is the state administration has come up with certain relief measures. So what are these relief measures? So the state administration has declared the untimely snowfall a special natural calamity, and it has provided relief to the affected orchard owners. So it has further announced 36,000 per hectare as damage to perennial crops like apple. So these are some of the moves that the state government has initiated in order to make sure that people do not suffer any further. So this is all we have to understand in reference to this article. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So the next article says national body set up to study rare form of diabetes. So what is the context? So there is one of the important study groups, and that is the National Monogenic Diabetes Study Group that has been formed to identify cases of monogenic diabetes across the country. So this will be supported by the Indian Council of Medical Research, as well as the Madras Diabetes Research Foundation and the Dr. Mohan's Diabetes Specialty Center, which will be the national coordinating center for the study groups. So what you will see in this condition is there are basically two types of diabetes. One, you have a single gene that it acts upon, and then you have the other, which is also called as the multiple genes. So what we are discussing here is a monogenic diabetes. This is a group of disorders where the mutation, that is the number of changes that has been happening because of the diabetes, happens on a single gene. There are other types of diabetes as well. Let's take for example the type 1 diabetes or the type 2 diabetes. So in these type of diabetes, what you will see is it is acting on the multiple genes, but in the monogenic diabetes, as the name goes, it is a mono, which means it is acting on a single gene. The most important point that we also have to understand is these monogenic diabetes, most cases of the monogenic diabetes are actually inherited. So what are the various types of monogenic diabetes? So the first important type that we have to understand is the maturity onset diabetes of the young, also called as the MODY. So this is one among the most common form of the monogenic diabetes. So it usually first occurs in the children or in the teenagers, but sometimes what happens is you will not be able to figure out whether that teenager has the diabetes until he turns into adulthood. So the first important type is the maturity onset diabetes of the young. The second important it speaks about is the neonatal diabetes. So this neonatal diabetes is further categorized into two types. So what are these two types? One, you have the permanent, the other is the transient. So what happens in the permanent is this is a lifelong condition. So it happens from the very early age, as early as the first 6 months of the life, and that is why it is called as the neonatal. So this rare condition occurs in the first 6 months of the life. It can become a permanent entity, and this can also be a transient one, which involves that it goes away after the first 6 months and then it can eventually return later in the life, and that is why it is called as the transient. So you have two important types. One is the permanent, which starts from the very early age and it will be there for lifelong, and then what you also see is the transient, which happens for the initial 6 months and then it goes off and then reappears after a certain period. And what is of importance to us is that this article goes on to say that there have been certain collaborations between this National Monogenic Diabetes Study Group, which will also have help from the Madras Diabetes Research Foundation. What they'll basically go on to do is they'll provide certain guidelines to all the collaborators for identifying this monogenic diabetes. So the minute they provide certain guidelines, what will happen is protocols will also be given to all these important collaborators so that they will be able to identify who is suffering from this disease, and in case they are able to identify, they can come up with certain mechanisms to control this disease. So this is what this article all about. So what we are discussing in this article is about the Point Callimore Wildlife Sanctuary. So the first important point from the prelims perspective, which can be a prospective question, is where is this Point Callimore Wildlife Sanctuary? So this Point Callimore Wildlife Sanctuary is a protected area in the region of Tamil Nadu and is also important because this is a Ramsar site. So the point right now is, what is the context speaking about? So there was one of the study, and this study was done by researchers from the Bharatidasan University, and what this study goes on to say is that the water quality in this area of the Point Calimore Wildlife Sanctuary might be completely unsafe for the avian, that is the birds, to feed as well as breeds. So what is the concern that it speaks about? So when we look into the concern aspect, what this article goes on to say is, so you have the pH level as well as the salinity level. This has comparatively increased, and this is much beyond what is expected from the ecological sensitives. It has also compared its results with the Central Pollution Control Board as well as the United States Environmental Protection Agency standards to reach to this conclusion. So it is not only an independent study, but it has confirmed the same thing with the Central Pollution Control Board as well as the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So the next point that we have to consider is, what are the causes? Why is that the pH has been increasing? What are the various sources as to why the pH as well as the salinity has increased? So the first point that we have to understand is the industrialization, and one such company is the chemical company. So the chemical companies in and around this area goes on to make sure that all these untreated effluents that are there is directly dumped into these waters. They are untreated. So because there is direct dumping of the chemicals, and also what you also see is that there are certain salt pans. So these salt pans in and around that area are also a cause of problem. You have the major industries, one such as the chemical industry, which has increased the pH, and apart from this, what we also see is the salt pans in and around that region, which has increased the salinity of the water. Apart from this, what we also see is a small scale shrimp farms in and around that wetland, which has also considered a threat to the biodiversity as well as the ecosystem of that particular sanctuary. So what is the impact? So the impact is, the atmospheric temperature at these stations has comparatively increased, and it is coming up to 36 to 40 degrees centigrade. So because there is an increase in the temperature, what you will see is certain harmful microorganisms that have been growing in the eggshells as well. So this could be a devastating problem to the future generation of all these birds. And the next key important point that it goes on to say is, there is high acidic as well as the high alkaline water. So because of this high alkaline water, what this can impact is the metabolic as well as the developmental activities of wild animals as well as birds in and around this region. So the third important point that this article goes on to say is that the microbial indicators such as coliform bacteria were all found to be very high at all the 5 sites. So when there is increase in the coliform bacteria, and when you have these birds which are feeding and drinking the contaminated water, this can lead to certain deformities in the birds. So what are the deformities? This can cause a certain change in the natural behavior, and at the same time this can even affect their long distance migration. So these are the possible impacts because of this article. So in this article, what we are discussing is about Ranganathittu. So this is also known as the Pakshikashi of Karnataka. It is the bird sanctuary in the Mandya district of Karnataka. It is on the banks of the Kaveri river. It is home to a myriad species of birds, both Indian and migratory, as well as the marsh crocodiles, flying foxes, and even monitor lizards. So why are we discussing this article? That is because you have these bamboo clams that are showcased in the picture, right? What is happening is, you have large number of people visiting Ranganathittu, and the number goes on to nearly 4 lakh people who visit this sanctuary. So what these people are doing is, on these bamboo clams, they have their names imprinted on it. So because they have their names imprinted on it, what you will see is certain concerns that have been voiced. Why? Because this is kind of irritating for the birds. This will disturb the birds, and at the same time this will spoil the beauty of the sanctuary. So in order to address these key concerns, what the sanctuary authorities have taken is one of the important calls, that is, they are planning to come up with all the installations of the CCTV cameras to track who these miscreants are, and the minute they identify who these miscreants are, they'll be filing cases against those visitors who are caught vandalizing the trees, and then they'll be asked to pay certain fines, which will be decided by the sanctuary authorities as well. So this is what we need to understand in reference to this article. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So the next article says, Indian War Memorial unveiled in France. Why is it important from the world history perspective? Is because this is the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. So let's understand certain factual data that this article goes on to present. So it says World War I officially began on July 28, 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and lasted until 1918. So now is currently we are in 2018 and it is 100 years. That is why it is becoming a very important article. During the World War I, you had what is called as the Central Powers, which made up the Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, as well as the Ottoman Empire, which fought against the Allied powers, which consisted of the Great Britain, the France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, as well as the United States. So kindly remember the Central Powers as well as the Allied powers. So how did India contribute? So what this article goes on to say is India contributed more than 1.5 million troops, of which 1.3 million fought overseas across all theaters, and approximately 72,000 were killed. So these soldiers who were employed for the Allied powers went against the Central powers, and they were employed in the German Empire, in the East Africa, they were employed on the Western Front. They have served in various regions of France, Belgium, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Gallipoli, Palestine, and Sinai. So you have all these Indian soldiers employed by the British to serve their army in and around the world. And at the same time, what Indians also provided was about 1.7 lakh animals as well. And all these horses that Indians provide were one of the finest during those periods. So in order to commemorate this, the British came up with the British commemorated the war by constructing the arch known as the India Gate. So this India Gate was designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens in the New Delhi's Rajpath. So the Indian Gate was originally named All India War Memorial, and it was built to pay homage to the soldiers of the Indian Army who lost their lives fighting for the British Empire in World War I as well as the Third Anglo-Maratha War. So this article also speaks about one of the important factual data, and that is the color of remembrance. So this marigold will be the symbol of remembrance for all those Indian soldiers who were martyred in the World War I. So the marigold in this case was selected because it is easily and widely available in India, and at the same time saffron symbolizes the color of sacrifice. That is why the Ministry of Defense goes about selecting marigold in this case. And world over, what we also see is that poppy was used as a symbol of remembrance in Europe, as it is grown widely in the Flanders field in the Europe, where some of the major battles were fought. So moving on, let's look into some of the practice questions. So the first question is, which of the following is or the advantage of the practicing drip irrigation? So the answer for this is 1 and 3 only. So the next question says, with reference to the religious history of India, consider the following statements, and the answer for this is 2 only. So the next question is, tengiometers are used to measure soil moisture condition. Moving on, let's look into some of the mains based questions. So the mains based question says, Indo-Pacific naming by US in reference to India seems as a very big picture but with small window for expansion and a tinge of confusion. Explain. So what is this article or this question all about? First, what we have to understand is the subject is about the Indo-Pacific naming. So what we have to also give is the definition for the same. So the definition says, at Shangri-La, Prime Minister Narendra Modi called Indo-Pacific a natural region that stretches from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of Africa. Why are we discussing this? It is because Washington changed the name of US Pacific Command into Indo-Pacific Command, and this was a recognition of the changing regional reality and the critical role of India in shaping the future of this region. So first we have provided the definition, and now what we have to see is it provides a very big picture. So what is the big picture that it speaks about? It says that Indo-Pacific skips the Asian landmass, that is China, and replaces it with 2 oceans, being interpreted as Washington's use of label, that is Indo-Pacific. So what this ideally goes on to say is you have 2 important terms, that is Indo and Pacific. When you say Indo, it means India, which is representing the Indian Ocean, and when you say Pacific, it means the Pacific Ocean representing the United States of America. And what this means is says there is no Asia Pacific, but it is Indo-Pacific. When you say Asia Pacific, what it means is the landmass, which also includes the China. But when you say Indo-Pacific, you are omitting the landmass, but you are considering only the oceans here. And when you consider the oceans, what we are indirectly referring is we are neglecting China in this metamorphosis that is taking place in the global order. What this further goes on to say is it means that the central point of Indo-Pacific, it neglects the Asian landmass, which could have given more weight to China, but now neglecting its presence. Now because we have taken the name of Indo-Pacific, it means more prominence is given to India rather than China in its security apparatus. Such a reading spurs Chinese paranoia about being contained and constrained between two oceans, facing the US on one side and the Indian on the other side. So what this article says is that we are picturizing a very big picture, and this big picture is nothing but we are neglecting China and we are giving more prominence to the Indian affairs is what this big picture is all about. But what we also have to understand it says it gives a small window for expansion and the tinge of confusion. So what this confusion is all about? The confusion is the United States of America named their command as Indo-Pacific, but the problem is it giving the same weightage in all its wordings? That is the major confusion. So the Mr. Trump first spoke about Indo-Pacific at the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Da Nang, Vietnam in November 2017. He hailed Vietnam as being at the heart of the Indo-Pacific. On one side, you change the name of Pacific Command to Indian Ocean, but you're not giving due importance to India. Why? Because the importance is given to Vietnam in one of the articulations that is made by Mr. Trump. And the next important point it says is the national security strategy views the ASEAN and APEC as the centerpieces of Indo-Pacific regional architecture. Again, India is not into picture. So what is this national security strategy? So this national security strategy is one of those documents that has been outlined by the executive branch of the United States of America, and where they give all the important criteria with respect to the security challenges and how they would be able to counter these security challenges is this national security strategy, and this will be provided to the Congress, that is the legislative domain. So what this national security strategy further does is it gives the centerpiece to the ASEAN as well as the APEC, again neglecting India. So Mr. Trump neglects India in this particular case. The national security strategy also neglects India, and at the same time India itself is unclear about what it means by the Indo-Pacific. New Delhi has tended to present the term Indo-Pacific as raising India's strategic nature, but at the Shangri-La dialogue, Prime Minister Narendra Modi hailed ASEAN as the foundation of the Indo-Pacific and asserted that the geographical definition could not be a strategy to contain any country. So on one side you have the confusion that is emanating from United States of America, where they are not giving any reference to India, and at the same time India itself is unclear about its process. So India says there is a vast stretch, but again it does not picture itself in this dominant role, but instead it says ASEAN is the foundation of Indo-Pacific. So there is a lot of confusion with respect to the definition as to what is this Indo-Pacific all about. And so the conclusion here says, so in order to address this key issue where the USA sees it more as an economic and business engagement, wanting to stop the authority of China using India, and India visualizes it more as a strategic engagement with United States of America, needs clear understanding. What USA says with respect to Indo-Pacific is containment of China, and what India says in this particular case is more of strategic engagement, that is more of a defense deal, and this needs to be cleared with respect to United States of America as well as India. So any future talks need to take this issue to bridge this dilemma and answering the questions that are unresolved. So you will have to make sure you give all these dimensions: one, the basic subject matter, then you are addressing the big picture, why is this confusion all about, and then on the conclusion bit you will also have to make sure that in case there is any future talks, they'll have to address these important unresolved questions. So this is how you need to end this answer. So write all your answers on the comment section. Looking into the BYJU'S CNA questions, we will evaluate and give you the relevant feedback for the same. So this is it for today. Thank you so much. All the best.